Welcome to everyone, and welcome to this session of Brown Bag Biography, the longest running seminar series on the University of Hawaii at Manoa campus. Today's talk is number 760, stretching back to 1987, and it's been organized and prepared by Zoe Sprout, the graduate assistant working at the Center for Biographical Research, and Paige Rasmussen, the managing editor. And they have managed the transition over into this virtual realm. So this is the second brown bag we've had since COVID ended them in March, and we're very glad to be back, and also actually welcoming things that couldn't have happened before. I know we've got at least one participant here from North Dakota, and there will be other people elsewhere. And so I think probably if we can get back to the point where we can go back to the face-to-face brown bags, we'll probably still keep some aspect of this component so that people around can share. Before I introduce our speaker today, I just want to mention what's coming up. Next week, I'm really looking forward to this one. Next week, we're doing a presentation entitled The Mid-Century Architecture of Alfred Price, an Australian refugee and Hawaii regional modernist. Some of you may know Alfred Price designed the Arizona Memorial. He also designed a number of other significant buildings in town, but he's also extremely well known for the fact that he basically started the State Foundation on Culture and the Arts. So he was a remarkably important individual, and the irony of the Arizona Memorial is in part that after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, he was rounded up with all Germans, Austrians, and Swiss and put in relocation camp. So, and eventually got out, but long and interesting life. And the presentation's being done by Laura Mcguire, who is in the School of Architecture. She received a National Endowment for the Humanities grant to be doing a biography of Alfred Price. And I have a personal interest in it because in doing a number of oral history presentations or living history presentations, there have been a couple of times when I've actually been Alfred Price. So I'm really looking forward to next week. And if you want to find out further about the upcoming events, that material is also available. Zoe can probably put the links up in the chat area. We have a full roster that will extend through the rest of the semester, and we're looking very much forward to that. All right. As far as our talk today is concerned, the title is Reading Mediated Identities, Autobiographical Agency in the Material Book, Museum Space, Social Media Platforms, and Archives. And this will be, this presentation will be by Amy Carlson, who joined the University of Hawaii at Manoa Hamilton Library faculty in October of 2000. So we are actually celebrating your 20th anniversary right now.
Yes.
And she currently serves as both the Collection Services Division Head and the chair of the Serials Department. But in addition to those two hats that she's wearing now at the library, and a number of hats she's worn over the years, she also graduated from the University of Hawaii at Manoa in December 2019 with a PhD in English. Her dissertation received one of the two prizes awarded for the 2020 Biography Prize from the Center for Biographical Research, and part of that award is actually for part of the award. In addition to there is a modest cast award, there is also a request that the person present their work at a brown bag biography. So this actually is the Biography Prize presentation for the fall of this year. I just want to mention a couple of other things. I first met up with Amy in 2008 when she was in the MA program. She took a course on life writing and translation. I also had the honor of directing her MA project, which was on translations of Japanese manga, and particularly autobiographical material in manga. And a very interesting dissertation, a very interesting project, which not only talked about production and translation and fan culture and the particular idiosyncrasies of how people represented themselves in manga, but it was also very interesting because what it was anticipating of her future work. Amy is interested in the places that she's interested in, those things which coincide, those things which overlap, those things which somehow they get drawn together in strange ways, often as a kind of matrix of archival issues, technological issues, intellectual issues. In other words, running the gamut, and basically demonstrated as a student that what she really wanted to do was think about everything all at once. So the organization and the presentation became the challenge, and those things in both cases she's mastered wonderfully. It's been a pleasure to watch her development within the program, even at the same time that she was performing major administrative functions and, at the university. And she's in some ways a model of what often just gets very flippantly thrown around as the notion of lifelong learning. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this presentation. So I would like to introduce to you Amy Carlson.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not a brown bag without me starting with an autobiography. So we've started with my biography from Craig, and now my autobiography. And so I just wanted to say really quickly that, you know, part of my dissertation came from a couple different places, one being my work in English, the other, my work in the library or in the library world, my professional knowledge and expertise. And when I sat and looked at all of my papers, after I was done with all my coursework, I saw two major themes. One theme being intertextuality, translation, adaptation, things like that. And that came from the English side. From the library science side, I saw a lot of issues about access and modes of access, making sure that people have access to things in different kinds of ways, getting access across. But what happens when you take something that is an object and scan it, or take images of it and give it to people? They have, you know, you've just created a very wide audience, but can they access it in the same kind of way? So those were kind of themes throughout all my coursework. And that helped immensely when looking at my dissertation. And I thought, oh, I thought I had done all these disparate papers that didn't interconnect at all. And it turns out that they all did. And they all connected on those two major themes of access and intertextuality. Okay, so that's my quick autobiography. And now bear with me. I'm going to turn my screen to my slides and turn my image off. So I'll probably look a little funny while I'm doing this. And so my talk today is Reading Mediated Identities, Autobiographical Agency in the Material Book, Museum Space, Social Media Platforms, and Archives. Okay, between April and August 2014, artist Amalia Ullman filled her Instagram with what appeared like a perfect life, spiraling out of control, hitting rock bottom before finding a sense of calm. This was her Instagram performance entitled Excellences and Perfections. Split into 3 parts, Ullman performed Okay, thank you, sorry. Split into 3 parts, Ullman performed 3 different online personae, frequently enacted by users across the platform. As Emma Mcguire notes, these 3 identities, the Kawaii girl, the hustler, and the New Age healed girl, are mediated via 3 distinct aesthetics, each with its own series of technological, material, and visual cues, suggesting how viewers should engage with the representations. Online spaces are filled with online lives. How we represent our lives and those of others have become varied and sophisticated, mediated by an increasingly complex set of personal, cultural, technological, and political factors. And here's a quote, "Nowhere is the power and diversity of the autobiographical more visible than online," end quote, Anna Paletti and Julie Rack declare. When people share a video, picture, tweet, or post, and more people interact with it, does it remain the same text or change relationally in response to the people who manipulate it? to what's around it on the page? What prompts people to post their own autobiographical traces online? And what motivates them to constantly share the traces of others? How do the social media networks and platforms themselves shape online lives? How do online lives intersect with offline ones? These online representations carry code and file and metadata information along with them. Yet, they are highly malleable, technologically easy to capture, modify, and then upload again. Sharing and spreading is a key activity. But who benefits from our autobiographical content and activity? Most social media platforms are for-profit enterprises, requiring users to sign terms of use agreements that above all secure the company's right to the user's data. For while a platform security setting may seem to protect our pages, posts, and tweets, what protects us from the platform itself? A friend or follower would have seen Almond's images sequentially and spontaneously, encountering them when she posted them, as they happened, something close to real time. Consumed in this matter, each image or group of images stands alone, leaving time and space for comments, questions, and responses from her audience. Thus, each post belies the planning and work that actually went into producing this highly scripted and controlled social media performance. Confused by the sudden turn of events in Almond's evolving story, fans, followers, and members of the art world started questioning what was actually happening in her life. This is the consequence of reading the texts as they appeared in real life and in real time. But that's not how I read them. While Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and now even Snapchat, allow a follower to read all of the feeds chronologically, and actually, I don't know if anybody had this problem, but I certainly did. My Instagram now is not chronological, and I'm very mad about it. So just as an aside. The display itself requires that we work backwards. With recent changes to Instagram, other changes, even open accounts such as Almond's require logging into Instagram to view it. In addition, anyone seeking her performance after her admission that she staged the installation has to deal with 3 issues: the knowledge that the Instagram sequence was fake, the presentation of the installation surrounded by Almond's own Instagram images, and the necessary registering of the performance out of order. While a disciplined reader will search out the start of the performance and read chronologically, the Instagram platform makes this task very difficult, especially today. And while she has kept excellences and perfections intact, Almond has significantly altered the rest of her Instagram content over the years. Even since I started this project, she had far more content, and she recently took down a lot of things that I had seen before. In 2018, the art book publisher Pastel released Excellences and Perfections in book form in chronological order. This adds another version, another text capturing and mediating this installation. And in a totally different form too, a different medium. How I read each version of this performance depends not only on my interpretive framework, but also my mode of access. I offer this selfie account as primer for the talk ahead. It asks us to look more closely at the systems and processes of hidden mediation that alter autobiographical works. Any critical analysis of such works will benefit from recognizing the process and the agents involved. But uncovering these mediations, specifically in relation to life narratives, also reveal the changing strategies authors, artists, and even corporate platforms are adopting to shape, control, or resist autobiographical work. By drawing attention to these usually and often deliberately concealed workings, I hope to register and display the profound shifts taking place in the production of life narratives and in how we read them. So I'm going to go through a description of my chapters in the dissertation, and it's going to be a relatively quick description. In chapter 1, I consider the materiality of the autobiographical text. Embodiment is a key concern in life writing. Since the subject examined is often a textual representation linking body and memory. As Sidoni Smith and Julia Watson remind us, the body itself is a text, quote, a site of autobiographical knowledge, as well as a textual surface upon which a person's life is inscribed, end quote. Because, quote, embodied subjects are located in their bodies and through their bodies in culturally specific ways, end quote. Autobiographical works are sites where authors make those distinctive connections to their bodies through words, voice, visual representation of the creators and others' bodies. Authors and artists are increasingly incorporating objects or physical structures into their autobiographical texts. Critical scholars and readers need to develop more strategies for approaching these often complex material works and for locating the embodied voices. And yet, while many scholars are undoubtedly taking format and medium into consideration, most focus upon the visual and textual materials as representations rather than the physical objects. Photographs, art installations, and graphic narratives all have material aspects not fully addressed if the visual narrative is the critic's only concern. This physicality causes the text as objects to lose their connections to their creators. When the physical text moves into a new medium, this changes how we can access or how we deal with the text and what we know about it. We can't feel the heft. Sometimes we don't know size, or we don't have that contextual information. In such cases, identity traces take on new meanings, further alienating them from supposed referential source, while at the same time offering greater or easier access to the life represented because of the benefits offered by the new medium. These simultaneous losses and gains are a key to understanding autobiographical texts as objects. Drawing from Alfred Gell's claim that the creators and owners of objects impart agency through an abduction process, and from Sarah Kimber's and Joanna Zelinska's concept of mediation as an ongoing process, I consider how agency of materiality imparts our autobiographical readings of two texts. So one is the Diaries of Liliuokalani, Queen Liliuokalani, as encountered by Miriam Fuchs. And the other is Dana Walrath's autobiographical visual book, Alice Heimer's Through the Looking Glass. This is a very interesting book. I highly recommend it. Anybody who is going through any kind of Alzheimer or dementia journey with a family member. The highly physical nature of both texts, the Queen's original diaries and the artist's book, alters as they move into a more accessible form, whether through transcription or through commercial publication. The question here is straightforward. Given the materiality of texts, that they must be bent for reasons of distribution or preservation, how does this change affect our reading of them? Chapter 2 turns its attention to the museums themselves, their practices, negotiations, and accompanying presence, both physically and online. Museums frequently mount autobiographical objects and testimonial works. For a limited time, the museum's white walls and parquet floors house works of resistance, witness, or identity exploration. Then, the curators take down the canvases, turn off the computers and projectors, or carefully fold up textiles and pack them away. Building upon the materiality and agency questions raised in Chapter 1, here I ask, how do current practices and processes in the museums alter the mediation of the autobiographical works? And I'll go into a little bit more detail in just a little while. In something of a return to the realm of the selfie, Chapter 3 begins a 2-chapter engagement with social networking sites and lives online. While it may appear that social media end users control identity creation through an iterative process free of constraints, many life narrative scholars point out the technology itself and the groups using that technology that prescribe identity performance. Social media and other online spaces have a series of coaxes, affordances, exigencies, and constraints, which drive both identity performances and how we consume them. Above all, as Henry Jenkins, Sam Ford, and Joshua Green proclaim, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. And that's their description of spreadable media. Drawing extensively from the work of life-writing critics, theorists, and media scholars, I focus on the changing nature of that technology, what motivates and guides users who create, consume, and pass on autobiographical messages in various virtual environments, and what happens to those messages as they spread. In Chapter 4, I shift my attention to the irreproducibility of online texts and performances. Online texts and other autobiographical productions have a reputation for assuming that because of their virtual status, they will somehow last forever. But through what means and in what forms? Online texts are both pervasive and yet fragile. Technological obsolescence is already complicating or even prohibiting access to older electronically mediated autobiographical texts, leading critical scholars to raise issues about permanence. Social media platforms need users to produce, post, and respond. But how do users resist these demands? And when and how do they succeed? In turn, the platforms themselves develop archiving strategies and policies that result in message decay as forms of control over the online actions of their users, but ultimately over their offline identities as well. As life narratives vacillate and navigate between various limited and more permanent options for placing lives online, the results are having increasingly wider implications for the representation of lives both on and offline. In the final chapter, I move into the archives. And I see lots of archivists here. so that makes me nervous. No. Archives tend to be seen as stalwart and unchanging, regardless of format. Oh, I forgot to advance my slides. These are very, just as a note, because I didn't do my job here. These are two quick images for how recent changes to the algorithm in Instagram and how that impacts influencers predominantly. But what influencers are doing with these particular charts is they're also saying, users, this is how you can help us to do our business. Okay, back to the archives. As the hallmark institutions and collections for preserving and protecting the kernels of memory and history, archives house the records for composing official stories. The practices of archives are highly professional and authoritative. Even online and digital access to archival materials, as it increases, the archives as institutions still place restrictions on use through closed collections, limited reading room hours, material preservation practices, use surveillance, building security, and other contractual requirements for users. Just as the curator and the museum determine which objects we can see and what's important about them, so too the archivist and the archives exercise power over what is accepted and kept, what is discarded, what can be viewed, and how. Combining archival theory with mediality, memory, and life writing scholarship, we begin to see the archive's often invisible mediation, the narratives that uphold it, and the recent changes in the profession directed towards acknowledging and rethinking its agentive role. The degree to which recognizing the problems of historical insularity and the need to decolonize the archive itself has led the archival profession to take steps towards greater contextualization, community feedback, and participatory records control. And here for this chapter, I read Sydney Iokea's The Queen and I as an example of this work and how it operates on both cultural and personal levels. So the instability of texts, regardless of medium, result in strategies of control over life narratives, as well as initiatives for creating and accessing mediated alternatives. So I've been repeatedly asking, and I repeatedly asked throughout my dissertation, who is controlling what and for what purpose? So now I'd like to spend a few minutes going into more detail about chapter 2 on mediation in museums. And really this is like what I learned from Professor Kosasa's amazing material culture class. So thank you, Professor Kosasa. Everything I learned from you. So, an important part of reading and understanding works in a museum space is recognizing the decisions made before you walk through the door. Some of these we realize and come to expect, but others we are accustomed to ignore. As artists extend the possibility of the gallery space with installations beyond the physical and static into the temporary process-oriented or performance-driven works, they challenge the established conventions of display. For this talk today, I would like to briefly discuss issues that complicate access to autobiographical art in the museum space, labels in physical environment, preservation, conservation concerns, removal of works, and performance or process-based art. Like many museum spaces, the room itself is supposed to fade away into a nondescript backdrop. The curator or museum staff have planned every element in this room: the entry point, the lights, the additional walls, the labels, wall glosses, the colors surrounding us, the temperature, and environmental conditions. These act on the viewer without direct recognition. And that's that idea of the white cube. Such austerity conceals the economic and social differentials playing out within those white walls. the goal of the innocuous museum space is to focus visitors' eyes on the art alone. But a museum's design and physical space affects not only our visual field, but our physical, sensory, and spatial understanding as well. Specific qualities of the oral, visual, or spatial environment, so sounds reverberating in an open marble sculpture hall, or the dimly lit and close confines of the pastel exhibit, affect the visitor's senses, even when they are supposedly focused on the objects on display. But so too does the location of the front door, or the entire museum, and so do the opening and closing hours, the rules of entry, granting rights of access to some people at certain times while denying them entirely to others. And no matter how hard museums try to conceal or direct the visitor's attention away from their institutional pasts, political alliances, funding sources, or acquisitions and curatorial practices, these are all deeply embedded in the physical space and the ongoing operations. This physical museum space embodies socially constructed and negotiated assumptions that more often than not reflect and sustain dominant power structures. The ethnographies, catalogs, classification systems, labels, and value determinations for collected items deployed in the museum's everyday operations can both illuminate represented cultures and subsume them within the dominant culture informing the institution. Furthermore, museums are not just object repositories or material assemblages, but nexuses of social processes and assertions of power. As Bernadette call it, a complex network of agency. Because agency is inherent to its operations, this network is especially responsive to autobiographical works displayed in the museum's gallery rooms and created spaces. These responses, however, tend to resolve themselves through the series of negotiations, decisions, and agentive acts, such as label creation, that traditionally and customarily define museum operations. So labels, for instance, mediate between the objects, the museum goers, and the museum as an institution. Tacked up on the wall next to the artwork, the anonymous label seems so innocent and informative. They supply what the curator, perhaps in consultation with the other stakeholders, wants to tell museum goers about the object. Acting as an intermediary between the artist, her work, and the museum goer, the curator intervenes through the label. In this way, they may frame, stimulate, and enlighten, but they also might scold, dictate, subvert, proclaim, and confuse. And no matter who actually writes them, labels convey official messages about their objects. Once placed on the wall, they become official, with some or all of their 30 words or so offering a translation or distillation of the object's testimony. Museum labels therefore function similarly to other forms of condensed life writing, such as the obituary, the autobiography, or contributor's note, genres that serve specific purposes and that package ideological resistance or personal idiosyncrasy within a socially determined template. Most exhibitions and installations have limited display periods. With each new show, a new story. With each closing, the walls are whitewashed, wiping the slate clean for new stories to emerge. Though no longer occupying a public space, traces and remainders of these installations linger. Memories, camera phone pictures, an exhibit catalog sold in the gift shop, websites that still have hosting, promotional, and explanatory materials on it. Even some permanent holdings have limited times on view. Even some permanent holdings have limited times where they're on view, and many works are hidden in private collections. For these categories, limited or no mediated forms exist. Sometimes community protests or administrative censorship lead to the removal of a work from the museum's walls. For certain kinds of art, then, a museum goer may only encounter one stage or portion of its existence, never having access to the work in its entirety. The need to be physically present or to experience certain kinds of works increases mediated access and limits sensory engagement. I am especially interested in what happens when we can no longer view the artworks due to issues of preservation and care, censorship, or by the very nature of performance art itself. Many works are fragile. Colors fade, years of exposure to humidity or to air pollution prove damaging, or more recently, technological obsolescence requires continuous upgrading and maintenance. Museums take extraordinary precautions to preserve and conserve their most fragile works, including strict control of their physical environments. So anybody who's seen the Mona Lisa, for example, at the Louvre knows that it's a very small painting and it's very hard to look at behind the box, the glass box that it's in, and also the 30 or so people that are around it. But that's a, you know, you're seeing it mediated through plexiglass. But even under these favorable conditions, many works deteriorate. Increasingly, museums provide digital facsimiles of their collections, including withdrawn and stored works. Okay, so Zoe or Paige will put up a link to this one so that you can see the Tate Gallery's website of this particular work. But, okay, so here is one such work from Tate Liverpool. Donald Rodney's photograph in the house of my father captures an image of his own hand holding a folded and pinned structure constructed of his skin. This tiny house is a separate artwork entitled My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother. He created these two works in the hospital while battling sickle cell anemia, first creating the fragile house out of skin removed during surgical treatments, then having a photographer capture it nestled in his hand as the white hospital sheets served as a backdrop. Like much of his work, both pieces are highly autobiographical, tightly focused on his diseased body. G. Thomas Kauser suggests that through the act of self-representation, memoirists redefine their own experiences on how the world sees or can never fully see their disability. But because their memoir is, quote, written from inside the experience in question, it involves self-representation by definition, and thus offers an opportunity for personal reevaluation of that condition, end quote. Rodney's two works redefine intersections of family and disease in separate ways. The house constructed of removed, dried skin and pins is almost unbearably material. But the photograph operates visually as a site of contrasts. The dead skin home nestled in his live hand, his body covered by hospital sheets, one artwork containing another. Neither I nor anyone else will ever see the house itself alone. While the skin sculpture and the photograph are separate works, In the House of My Father compresses the two into one. Easily digitized and distributed, the photograph is also the one mediated version of My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother, authorized by Rodney himself. In a sense, then, Rodney has made a cut of a cut. And as Kemper and Zielinska explains, photography is, quote, an act of practice of cutting through the flow of mediation, where the cut operates on a number of levels, perceptive, material, technical, and conceptual, end quote. Rodney coupled the photographer's cut with his own surgical cut, freezing in place his precarious identity in illness and health, and therefore telling his story outside of medical discourse. But by flattening the 3D skin sculpture into a 2D image, the photograph will only ever offer the viewer the roof, a corner, and two sides of the house, perched on Rodney's hand. By identifying the two as separate works, viewers recognize that they are encountering something that they can see but not see simultaneously. Through the sculpture is the reason for the photograph. You cannot fully view the sculpture. The two are intertwined. But at the same time, this photograph is my only way to view the sculpture at all, and I am dependent on the photograph's mediation. I'm also dependent on Tate Liverpool's website. Also, it's another form of mediation. I contacted the gallery to find out more about My Mother, My Father, My Sister, My Brother. So that's the sculpture. Where is its current location? Is it in storage? Is it on display? Since writing about it forces me to rely on a mediating surrogate, the website, of another surrogate, the photograph, can I really discuss a work so far removed from my own experience? Do the surrogates provide enough detail? Do I have enough sense of size, weight, color, density of the tiny structure? Can I separate the life narratives they embody if I see one through the other? And given this fact of access, how do I cite the works? Actually, that was a major problem throughout all my dissertations. How do I cite everything? These works of works of works, right? I received a reply from Tate Liverpool. in the house of my father will remain the only access provided to this piece. My mother, my father, my sister, my brother. So it's not available for view any other way. Because autobiography inevitably shifts the viewer's gaze outside of their own personal experience, works with such content can prove especially controversial, often because they reveal insecurities or deeply held opinions that make viewers uncomfortable, or because they push hard against a social boundary. Sidoni Smith and Julia Watson point to this sort of criticism leveled at Tracy Inman for her controversial, partially ready-made work, My Bed, from 1998. While art forms resist, testify, and represent new ways of seeing our world, autobiographical art forms engage more intensely with issues of identity and representation, often making strong connections between personal experiences and identity formation within a cultural, social, or historic milieu. Although relatively rare, some museums do remove controversial artworks from view. Now, there is a link to this next piece. Oh, my slide is not advancing. Oh, okay. Thank you. Thank you. There's a link to this piece by Kara Walker, but I do recommend that it is very hard to view. I'm giving a trigger warning ahead of time. It is a caricature of slavery, and in the most graphic and violent way. Okay, so I just, if you click on the link, just be prepared. Either too painful or too insensitive or too socially disruptive pieces are removed. Protest often precedes removal. In July 1999, the Detroit Institute of Arts Museum pulled one of Kara Walker's works, The Means to an End, a shadow drama in 5 acts, from a new exhibit, citing concerns raised by members of the local African-American community. Walker's work offered a graphic caricature in floor-to-ceiling shadow portraits. So this is an enormous work, okay, of slave life, inevitably tapping into painful and unresolved cultural and collective memories. This is a hallmark of Walker's work. Pointing to her constant self-referentiality, Gwendolyn Dubois Shaw suggests that the, quote, disturbing and often melancholic tone of Walker's art reflects and offers up for critique the problem of the broader culture's inability to come to terms with the past, end quote. For life writing scholars, this very public removal of The Means to an End from the Detroit Institute of Arts entwines Walker's art, autobiography, and censorship in ways that can never be disentangled. Furthermore, although removing the installation kept people from viewing it at certain time or a place, this act provoked many others to search out mediated forms, and the controversy itself has proved to be a stimulus and a barrier for mounting her work at other museums and galleries. Anticipating possible controversy, the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis engaged its audience ahead of time, recognizing the difficulties surrounding the depictions for their show in 2008, Kara Walker, My Compliment, My Enemy, My Oppressor, My Love, which also showed this piece. The Walker provides an example of an alternative approach to controversy, censorship, and withdrawing works from view. But while the DIA's decision to remove her work provided an immediate resolution, it had far-reaching consequences. Put another way, life writing scholars are particularly suited to recognize that denying direct access to her original larger-than-life installations may be the result of the very qualities that make her work interesting and important, the inseparability of the personal, the historical, and the political. Okay, so I turn our attention now to something happening in a gallery someplace live, possibly body art or perhaps a computer program running a multimedia installation. So performance or process-based art. How does my experience of an artwork change if I experience it, watch it on video, or see an image of a moving work, or read an account of someone else's experience? Is documentation more authoritative? What happens if I view an installation evolving over time? Or if I participate in a performance, then watch a mediated version, say a video, at a later time? Have I just watched an adaptation of my own record? What is gained through surrogacy and what is lost in the process? Performance and process-driven works comprise my final category of artworks whose very nature may necessitate a mediated form. Performance art can not only heighten sensory experience through its presence in a carefully created environment, but unlike object-oriented or visual works in a gallery, it can also directly aim to increase or mute response as part of the experience. Through presence and spectatorship, the attendees respond to the artist's demands for participation without necessarily having or wanting to have a uniform experience. To make this point, Quinn Eads and Anna Paletti chronicled their attendance at Marina Abramović's In Residence through 2 running columns on each side of the page, offering their free thoughts and associations, their actions, and their responses to what was required of them. So there's a link in the chat to some information about this particular performance. The performance itself called for muted sensory perceptions, which directed what they wore, what they could and couldn't hear, and required them to remove watches and phones. Through their dual narration in present tense, they draw the reader into their experiences of their bodies, eyes, ears, and wandering and worrying minds. Mediation and documentation enables access to performance or process-based art after the show ends. Philip Auslander notes that it's not the audience that makes it performance art, but the framing and documentation of it as such. Amelia Jones suggests that the lack of presence haunts performance studies. Quote, they can only ever be subjectively enacted in the first place and subjectively retrieved later. There is no singular, authentic, original act we can refer to in order to confirm the true meaning of an event, an act, a performance, or a body, presented in the art realm or otherwise, end quote. Performance art requires mediation through experience, memory, or documentation. The planning, the implementation, and documentation should not be ignored. Sarah Kember and Joanna Zielinska proposed that an idea of liveness is actually, quote, an illusion of liveness, end quote, a social construct with performative potential. They argue that it is precisely during these kinds of performances that we recognize the process by which we co-create events. Both the planning required and effort necessary to install and perform a process-driven work materialize when we identify and ask questions about all the people, including ourselves, who realize the piece. These highly mediated works recall Susan Stewart's idea of the gigantic as an all-encompassing, devouring idea beyond our ability to describe. Life writing scholars have always recognized this as a fundamental issue in autobiography, how to compress, reduce, or epitomize a life lived by means of a relatable and readable narrative. A performance may have begun before we enter the room and may continue after we exit. But the artist, the museum, and the autobiographer rely heavily on an illusion of liveness that leads us to accept the parts they willingly reveal and on their terms. Whether we experience it as a live performance, hurriedly following a figure on the floor, or watching a programmed image fill the room, we become absorbed into the mediated process of the art, which began before we stepped into the room or before even the artist entered the gallery for the live show, and which will continue on, mediated through our bodies and memory, even as we turn away or enter another gallery. Focusing on what happens to autobiographical artworks inside and outside the frame of the gallery, I have sought to identify what issues and considerations that life writing scholars have taken into account when considering original and mediated works in museums, and also what kinds of mediating forces have generally gone unnoticed or ignored. By seeking out and recognizing the work of curators, conservators, trustees, marketers, community members, and even ourselves, the complex network of mediation crystallizes before us. In turn, enhancing or detracting from the autobiographical texts themselves, this network of mediation can prove a rich companion to the art and provide necessary context for the scholar. But we must also understand that what an artist reveals, a museum may conceal. So recognizing the pervasiveness of mediation also primes us to interrogate it. Okay, so I want to take a moment here before I completely finish. These are images of my family actually at what used to be the Contemporary Museum, is now called Spalding House. And like many families, this was a place that we went to regularly throughout my kids' lives. And this is just a really special place for me. on this island. I really like it. And anyway, so I just want to relate something, a particular installation that I went to here that had more meaning for me because of it as this kind of familiar place. And so for those of you that don't know, this museum is behind hedges and anonymous walls, tucked away in Makiki Heights, converted from Anna Rice Cook's Art Deco mansion, and arguably the most impressive, well, I don't know, to me anyway, it's the most impressive of the multi-million-dollar properties hidden by the shrubberies and gates in the neighborhood. The museums and buildings and grounds spill down the hill, and actually one of the things we love the most is the garden area that my kids always refer to as the maze. And I went to an installation there now a number of years ago. And when I walked in, I saw 8 upright, meticulously fashioned dry boxes filling an L-shaped space with digital prints of fish ponds, maps, and then cut and quartered ulua. And the numbers on the quartered ulua refer to the land transaction prices and taxes that make up the official record of the museum and the surrounding area. And I apologize for this. This is my photography, and I'm very sorry. I'm going to turn it now to a label that is going to be a little hard to read. But basically, the label talks about some of the key houses in the area, and the artist was looking at all of the land transactions. So this is land transactions that are all, to many people, illegal land transactions. So keep that in mind. The size of the dry boxes and their status as family objects are significant, and so are the maps and pictures of the fish ponds. Their erased or lost names reasserted by inscribing them in red. When I returned to the first wall text where I had first entered the installation, I reread it, and I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of it, but I realized that this particular piece was asking me to do something that I don't think that another museum necessarily had asked me to do. And that's think about the land beneath it. Think about the house on that land and the financial transactions that went into it. So this is April A.H. Drexel's multimedia piece, Kupa'a. And it's explicitly pointing to the land on which the museum sits. And it implicates the museum, and explicitly the museum implicates itself by mounting this exhibit. It's complicit. and this work was, it's a highly decolonizing work. It does a lot. It's a great piece of art. Unfortunately, it's been sort of removed from the website, from Honolulu Museum of Art's website. And in addition to that, I think that somebody, either Zoe or Paige, will put up a link. The museum now is for sale. So just think about that for a second, that this piece is asking us to consider the land transactions that, you know, if I'm standing in a museum, I'm thinking of it as a solid place. It's not going to be unchanging, kind of like that idea of the archives. I'm never going to think that that's not going to be a museum. And yet here it is, it's up for sale again. And it's just, the story is never ending of the land transactions. Anyway, so that's just, I wanted to end it on just a slightly autobiographical note. And I just want to say thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing the screen if I can figure out how.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. That was tremendous. What we're doing, and we're still working our way through this, you would see in the chat that Zoe said, we're doing this by type in question and answer. I will read the questions you submit to Amy, and then she will answer them. We're doing this because there are still sort of security issues, all sorts of things that, in keeping with her talk, we're realizing about the mediation even after we're using it. As some of you may know, the business of Zoom bombing and people being able to introduce images or words into conversations that nobody wanted there ever has been a major problem. We've had people last week who asked, when they asked to join the brown bag, asked beforehand what were the security features that are involved. So in order to protect that, especially because we are recording this and we'll be putting up Amy's presentation, what we've done so that we don't have to go through and ask every individual whether it's all right for them to be represented here. That's why we don't have your images up, because also it means you could use the camera to put up images other than your face. So that's what we're doing, and we're moving more and more. We want to move, obviously, to as much as possible getting free interchange, conversations back and forth and whatever, but we're moving toward being able to do that when we can more fully understand the mediation. So if there are questions, please type them into the chat and I will pass them on to Amy. Comments as well. Okay, this is from David Gustafson. You touched on this earlier when talking about Instagram, and then later again talking about the selling of Spalding House, but I wonder if you could expand more about the role of corporate capital in mediating biographical and autobiographical texts.
I'll try to do it in 1 minute. Oh, that's a really big, that's actually just, that's enormous. I mean, it's enormous. And I think that, I think it's actually really important to look back at Julie Rack's book, Boom. That was, when I read that book, it really made such a difference in, and there have been so many different works that have made me look at margins, covers, you know, all the, you know, paratextual information. But when you think about explicitly like production processes, who's getting whom to produce what, then when you start to look at all these different spaces, whether they be online and all the ways that Instagram or like I was talking about influencers, like the influencers are trying to get their fans or their friends or followers to do something to help them, right? There's all kinds of different systems at play to coax or to force or to nudge people to do something. And that's true. We just sometimes don't look at those. So you don't necessarily see them in the case, or you don't directly think about them in the case of a museum, or you don't necessarily think about them in the publishing process. And yet they're always there and they've always been there. And so there have been a number of different books throughout this. I'm a librarian, so I always have a book to read, right? I always have a book suggestion for people. And the Surveillance Capitalism book from Zuboff, I think I'm not saying that correctly, but that book really talks about exactly this, that how much, and actually Kemper and Zelenska talk about this too, how much corporate culture is sort of making off of people's, you know, happy-go-lucky or supposedly happy-go-lucky, you know, personal comments and autobiographies that they are posting in Facebook and whatnot. So I guess I'm not really answering your question in a really good way. Oh wait, he wrote more too. Oh no, that's
another question.
That's another question. But I guess the main thing is that you kind of have to see what processes and systems are at play to see who's making money, who is reaping the benefit of every day when I log in or every day when I go consume this or don't, you know. I mean, that's one of the things that I guess I'm looking at almost, even though this project is done, I'm still looking at that. So
And I just add in that that's particularly important actually in the last few months, because individual identity and situatedness within the society actually determines how your material is treated. This is obviously coming up in terms of Facebook as to, you know, is it all right for somebody to post something that is fundamentally dishonest and demonstrably dishonest? How do you point that out? How do you decide it doesn't go up? And to tie it into what we're talking about, does it matter who's putting it up? Because in the
Oh,
debate over
yeah.
political discourse, right, the argument that it's me is actually the argument for why it therefore should not be censored or fact-checked or anything else. So that free political speech has actually, within many of these environments, actually come to be associated with the right to lie without any impunity, even if it's destructive. So the whole assessment of how individual agency and statement is going on in these environments, while at the same time the cash register is running harder and harder, the more stuff you put up there creates all sorts of, well, we're watching Mark Zuckerberg sort of rip himself apart because of these things. Okay, I'm going to move on to, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go first with Karen Kosasa and then with John, just because I can, and I think they're connected. All right. Yeah.
Okay, so Professor Kosasa's question is, thank you. I have one word for you: copyright. So I had some significant concerns after I heard that this was going to be on YouTube. I don't think that there's going to be an overwhelming rush of people viewing my YouTube video. I don't think that's a concern, but lawyers have bots and there are bots that crawl for certain terms, certain images, and certain other types of things. So the first person that I absolutely could not include in this at all was Kim Kardashian. And or Kim Kardashian West. And so those of you who are on my committee knew that I did discuss her selfie book Selfish in the introduction, and it's important also in comparison to Amalia Ullman, but I had to nix a lot of things directly from the slides because of licensing concerns.
Yeah, and I'll just repeat the question. The question there was, would you say a few words about your decision to limit the images you showed in your PowerPoint? I think it's a good strategy, but wondered if you could share your ideas on this to talk us through the artwork.
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I wanted to show the actual artwork. So literally the reason why I didn't was not, you know, I chose to put up people's names because I was concerned about copyright issues. I much rather talk about the pieces themselves. So linking them in the chat means that you can still have access to them. But the other reason though too is, and I probably should have given more of a trigger warning for my mother, now I'm saying it wrong, but the skin house, because that may be very disturbing to a lot of people. So two of the artworks, I probably should have, you know, by putting it in the chat, that means that somebody has to go and be desirous of looking at it and have to be aware that that's what they're going to get. So that's another reason. That's sort of a layer of mediation in between so that somebody can make a choice, so that it's not just on your computer screen without a choice.
And that's actually something that is augmented or actually improved to a certain degree, public presentations, because I have been at conference presentations where when the speaker put certain slides up on the screen, there was immediate outcry because certain people in the room, especially in conferences dealing with indigenous materials, frequently the putting of the artwork or the putting of the image up on the screen was deeply offensive to people, and they basically weren't warned. So what this does is actually set up a situation where that initial confrontation doesn't take place, but at the same time, people who want access to it can get it. And in this realm, you can actually be looking at the illustration while you're still hearing the speaker talk. But you get to choose as the audience rather than just basically having to take whatever comes. Okay, this is John Zern. Thank you for a great presentation, Amy. I'm wondering about the methodological challenges you faced while working with your materials, in particularly the online works. Have you been helped by your experience working with the more technical aspects of managing archives, physical and digital, as well as the various algorithms that come into play with academic databases?
Oh, okay. So I should say, first of all, that I'm a librarian. I'm not an archivist, and that archivists have special training. And so my knowledge of the archives is as an outsider, even though to the rest of the world, we kind of look similar. So I should say that straight up. Though I guess being a librarian, I'm a little bit closer than than the average, than I guess the usual life writing scholar. So I should say that. Being in the library puts me in a place where I do have more knowledge about certain types of licensing issues, restrictions, access, modes of access, use, a different kind of set of concerns. And so it's not a surprise to me already that the millions of dollars that we spend in online materials here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, it's rented, it's licensed, it's not owned. I mean, I already know that from my everyday job. And so I also know that there are certain mechanisms in place for automatic book decay for certain kinds of services. So you can view a book or a PDF for a short period of time, and then it'll just disappear from your device. And so these are things that are common in the library world. And so then when I see it outside in a different realm, I guess I'm primed to see it, but I don't necessarily know that I guess I'm primed to see it, but there are other people that can see it too. I have a colleague here at the library who is a programmer, and we did talk at length about some of the algorithms, some of the more technical, artificial intelligence and things like that are happening today that are kind of scary and exciting simultaneously. That, as a nation politically or not politically, but in terms of we're not really doing much about some of the AI that's impacting both our everyday lives and our future lives. And so some of that did come from some of my communication with my colleagues. But wait, let me see if did I answer all the question for that one?
John seems to think so. He says thanks.
Okay.
Okay. This actually came as a private question, but I think it will clarify because it actually ties into something else you were just mentioning. Somebody was asking, could you give an example of the kind of thing that would register the kind of shock that would take place at a conference when a slide just came up? I can give you a very specific one. There was a woman named Sarah Bachman. This is the early 19th century. She was African, and she was brought to London and advertised as the Hottentot Venus. Now, what was striking about her was an abnormally large posterior. And she was put on display for years until she died as this absolute sort of freakish body type. And lots of speculation, and she ended up being widely represented in political cartoons. You can imagine what would happen with an image like that. Well, I was at a conference and somebody was talking specifically about representations of African bodies and whatever. And one of the slides that went up was a slide from the early 19th century of a caricature representation of Sarah Bachman. And there were a number of people in the audience who were basically very upset about that, because the fact that you're showing an image of somebody being profoundly exploited and humiliated in racist terms does not absolve you. The fact that you point that out does not absolve you from the fact that you are still putting up and perpetuating that image. So that was one place I know where it came up. The number of people were very upset that the person had put up images of Sarah Bachman in talking about them. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, ordinarily I would be saying we need to end right at 1:15 so everybody can get to their next class, but that no longer has any kind of material dimension to it. Thank you all for coming. This has been a wonderful attendance, and I think we'd all agree that it's also been a very, very fine presentation, illuminating, well-informed, and totally worthy of the prize that it was awarded. So I hope that you'll join us next week. It will continue our issue of arts and curation because we'll be talking about Alfred Price. And so thank you again, Amy, and thank you all for attending.